as usual, I thought I'd start out with a couple of articles. And let me just comment that we do read a lot of things, and just as a reminder, we don't necessarily take these at face value. I think that the sources that I read are pretty reliable, but it's important we do our own homework and come to our own conclusions. And the purpose of these articles that we read is really to just kind of keep us up to date as to what's going on. And there's so much going on, as we all know, and it just seems to be happening at such a breakneck pace. And it just so many different areas, the economy, the immigration thing, all of these things, Afghanistan, and I just read today that our military is now projecting the very likely possibility of ISIS-K or Al-Qaeda again coming together, and potentially within the next 6 months to a year having the capability to commit acts of violence against the homeland. So just so much going on. And the question that I know I ask, and I don't have an answer to it, I have my own suspicions, is this all by design? Is there something behind the scenes or a group behind the scenes orchestrating all of these events? And if they are, why? And I would suggest that if there is, a dark state or whatever it might be, or foreign actors or whoever behind the strings, pulling the strings, that it's likely because of the World Economic Forum and the New World Order that is being really pushed and has gained so much in terms of just overall gumption, if you will, and just their desire to continue to move forward in a more blatant way than they have in the past. So these are all questions that I think we can ask, and it's fair to ask these questions. And then we'll see how they all play out. And I think, as we've said in the past, I personally, based on what we read in God's Word, don't believe things are going to get much better. I mean, it's kind of like, it's kind of like we're going along and things could seem as though they're getting better temporarily, and they may for a period of time. But I think we're on a trajectory that is exactly as Jesus laid out, that we're in the period of the birth pangs, and we know what happens with the birth pangs. So here's an article that is entitled. I'm not going to read every word for pretty obvious reasons, but this has to do with the proposed $3.5 trillion budget on top of all the other money that certain politicians are trying to push through. And as any, I think, economist will tell you, that with the condition that our economy is in right now, that would just absolutely be devastating. Now, I understand that the $3.5 trillion is probably going to be reduced if it's passed at all. There's nothing that says it will, but probably down to about $1.5 trillion on top of the 1.2 infrastructure bill and the $2 trillion that was issued before. And really, the question is, how do you pay for all of this? And those that propose it like to say it's not going to cost us anything, that we'll be able to put the burden on the backs of the upper 1% or whatever. But that's just don't believe that. It's just not possible that will happen. So what they do is they print this money, and they put it into the system. And what that means is greater supply of money, shorter supply of services and goods, and that leads to inflation. And now, unlike we heard not too long ago, that inflation is probably not transitory. It's probably going to be here for a while. So let me just read some highlights from this article. And I'm just underlined. I'm not going to read the whole thing, obviously, as we never do. But the $3.5 trillion budget won't cost you a cent. These policies are going to throw. Here's the truth: policies are going to throw the U.S. into a dark recession with record-level inflation, and it all hurts the little guy that the proponents say they support. No thanks, I'm good. These policy moves also clear the way for the biggest socialist power grab since Obamacare, and that's horrible for your constitutional rights. And so that's all part and parcel. What we're seeing is just the taking away of so many of our rights, which is consistent with the World Economic Forum and the Great Reset. Remember, we saw that video a couple of weeks ago where they come out and they say, you won't own anything, but you'll be happy. That's socialism, run amok, if not communism. And with socialism / communism has to come tyranny, has to come the ability to enforce. And so we're not there yet, but I think we're moving in that progression. First and foremost, the whole vaccination mandate that has been is being threatened not only tramples your civil rights, but it will also cost businesses millions in extra money to implement. There will be testing costs. There will be administrative costs. There will be legal costs. And do you think who do you think is going to pay for these costs? They will all be passed through to the cost of goods and services paid for by, guess who? The little guy. So the truth is proof's in the pudding. So it's going to cost, and it will cost big time, whether it's $1 billion, $1.5 trillion, or $3.5 trillion, or whatever the final number comes out to be. Now, we know that there are certain politicians that seem to be standing firm, and hopefully this whole thing just collapses under its own weight, but there's a part of me that says that they'll come to some sort of agreement. I'm not sure what that will be. What about the supply chain disruption? A record number of supply ships are floating around, we've all seen it on the news, in America's harbor. You can see the impact of that by just going to the grocery store, or any store for that matter. We're starting to look like a third world company. Anything from food items to spare tires for your lawnmower are backed up in this black hole of consumer goods. The supply chain crisis and failing labor prices are costing us little guys a small fortune. The Labor Department says prices are up for gas 42.1%. I think it may be even higher than that by now, and it's still going higher. Used cars up 24.4%, hotels 18%, TVs 12.7%, furniture 11.2%, meat, poultry, fish, and eggs 10.5%, electricity, and well, in a minute I'll briefly go over an article that talks about the rising energy costs that are also going to affect all of this. Restaurant prices 4.7%, rent 2.9%. A Moody's economist, that's a pretty solid source, says the increased prices have raised the cost of living for Americans by $175 a month in food, fuel, and housing. And that's just really kind of where that is. Here's another article by a guy from a writer at National Review, and pretty solid guy. His name is David Harzani. And just a couple of things. The $3.5 trillion bill that is being suggested they're now attempting to cram through Congress via reconciliation is meant to create a European-style cradle-to-grave welfare state here in the United States. So I think all these things combined, that you have to at least think that that's really what's behind a lot of it. The idea that traditional American life needs reimagining, i.e. build back better. What are we building? Why are we building it back? And how are we going to make it better? I thought it was pretty good a couple of years ago, but now we have to build back better, which, by the way, I think I've mentioned this, is the same motto that the World Economic Forum uses. So it's not just our administration, which I think is interesting. The idea that traditional American life needs reimagining that should be rejected first, because the most vociferous champions of the European-style governance are invariably the most passionate critics of the dynamism and glorious messiness of American life. And I went into and read Rules for Radicals number 5, which is written by Saul Alinsky, who is pushing for this move from where we are to a communist system. And he states in Rule number 5 in Rules for Radicals, he says, ridicule is man's most potent weapon. Think about all of the division that we've seen in the last few years between the police and minorities and certain lifestyles and everything else. This is what the radicals do. They attempt to create division between groups of people. It's irrational. There is no defense for this most potent weapon. This is what Alinsky says. There is no defense. It's irrational. It's infuriating. And it also works as a key pressure point to force the enemy, which is us, into concession. So that's Alinsky's rule number 5. And that's something that has been studied by many of our left-leaning politicians, Alinsky's rule for radicals. The factors that propel our economic superiority, unplanned, lightly regulated, individualistic, and seemingly disordered free markets, chafe against the technocratic sensibilities of the left. For them, even American exceptionalism, the idea that the United States occupies a unique position in world history, is ugly and plainly wrong. They hate affluence. They hate success. So they now perpetuate a corrosive culture of victimhood. Man, we've seen that big time in the last couple of years. Everybody's a victim. And you think about the cancel culture and how many things you can't say now, and changing names and changing team titles and this and that and all this nonsense that takes place. I'm not saying that some of it shouldn't happen, but it's crazy, and it's all because of this victim mentality. So now they perpetuate a corrosive culture of victimhood and dependence that already often permeates many European nations. So we're becoming more and more like European socialistic nations. And one of the most destructive untruths of the Europhile is his contention that meritocracy doesn't even exist. In other words, it doesn't matter how hard you work or whatever. Everything's got to be on a level, evil playing field. To convince people of this, he will fearmonger about growing poverty, the shrinking middle class, the rise of inequality, the inability of Americans to achieve their dreams without the paternalistic help of technocrats. In other words, things aren't going to get better until the government has complete, total control. We don't have the ability on our own to do it, even though the evidence that people can is overwhelming. What the left refused to acknowledge are trade-offs that accompany their utopianism. In other words, this perfect environment they're going to create through socialism. They either ignore or dismiss the economic downsides of dependency. And that's one of the things that all these bills are trying to do, is to create dependency, which is one of the reasons why we're seeing such a shortage of workers. They become dependent. They're being programmed, being conditioned to be dependent upon the government. And these left-leaning forces are just trying to fuel that, so that then they control everything and everybody. They dismiss the numerous core freedoms, both individual and communal, that are lost when living under the bureaucratic thumb of a monolithic, centralized, soul-sucking enterprise like the European Union. The all-encompassing welfare system progressives champion is reliant on transfer programs, wealth transfer, the redistribution, things like that, that pose moral hazards for society. Think about that, that if somebody has spent their whole life and have gained a certain amount of wealth or whatever, and then, as others would deem that to be too much and they take it away from you, that does create not just a moral hazard, but an unsafe hazard, I think, as well. We see this study in the largest number of people who have left the workforce during the COVID-19 and not returned, despite the availability of jobs, are those making more money from unemployment benefits than their former job. No one should dismiss the inherent unfairness that sometimes exists in any system, including ours, but a society that values and incentivizes personal self-determination also creates a strong work ethic, a strong sense of fairness, and more opportunity. If we follow Europe, we are in danger of losing those attributes. Real quick article from Victor Davis Hansen. I don't know if anybody's heard of him. A brilliant guy. He's on the news all the time. Here's kind of what he says. Sheer chaos and anarchy on the border. Afghanistan, the most humiliating defeat in recent U.S. military history. A labor-starved supply chain in shambles and holiday shelves emptying out. The worst inflation in 30 years that seems soon ready to match Carter-era levels. Gas hitting $5 a gallon with winter heating fuels soaring. Free for all looting in major cities. We've all seen it on the news. People just blatantly going in and knocking off stores because in some places it's not even a misdemeanor if the value of what they steal is under $500. So they're blatantly going in and doing these things. Never in recent American history has any administration birthed such disasters in the first 9 months. How could such sheer pre-civilizational calamity occur in modern America? Were these disasters a result of historic incompetency, or mean-spirited nihilism, or a deliberate effort to create the necessary turbulence to birth a new American revolution, or a bit of all three? The left now controlling Washington believes that the U.S. border is a mere construct. Every impoverished person has a birthright to cross into America illegally. The 2 million who are scheduled to enter this fiscal year alone is wonderful, if occasionally sloppy event. Think about what they're doing with this. And I don't know if you're reading this, but fentanyl. Anybody heard of fentanyl? What a dangerous drug that is. And there's people in here that know probably a lot more about it than I do. But Shirley and I went to a presentation by a doctor at the Avon Library a few years ago. He held up a little vial like this, and he says, if this was half full of fentanyl, it would be enough to kill everybody in this room. And I don't know, 50 people there maybe? Something. Yeah, probably a group about this size. That's how dangerous this stuff is. And the deaths from fentanyl, and it's being hidden in, with heroin or just taken in and of itself, it's a very scary proposition. And that reminds me of one of the prophecies, or one of the things that is mentioned in Revelation 6, that there'll be an increase of sorcery in the last days. And that word sorcery comes from the Greek pharmakia, which means drugs, potential drugs. And that's exactly what we're seeing. This is just horrific, what's happening because of this. And it's like there's no concern. There's another 30,000 or 80,000 or something moving in that are coming up through Central America that are due to arrive, and they're just not doing anything about it. Why? Why is this happening? A lot of fentanyl in China. Pardon me? In China, a lot of fentanyl. Yeah.
Somehow they bring it across the border.
Yeah.
They're coming into the Mexico area.
Yeah, and then it's distributed, and it's coming in large quantities. And It just doesn't make sense.
And even people that have it at home, because it's being administered for cancer, whatever, you don't want to throw those in the garbage. They literally take, the drug addicts literally take that thing and they eat it.
Yeah.
And, I mean, it's very, very dangerous.
Now, most
And
of that
don't put it
fentanyl,
down your system in your sewer
Yeah.
or anything either.
most of that fentanyl comes from China, and it's made there, and it makes its way over here somehow. And the question is that, are they trying to create this emergency situation for us over here, without coming right out and say it? I mean, it's just one more thing that you wonder about.
I heard that every year in America, more people die from fentanyl every year than died in the entire Vietnam War.
It's getting worse because it's just free. Now it's just, yeah. Now it's just freely coming over the border, so it's going to get worse. It's going to become an epidemic among our kids. Huh?
We don't have a border anymore. So
Yeah, I know.
come across the
Right. But that scares me. I must say, it really scares me because kids are vulnerable, and they're going to take this stuff unwittingly. It's just why? Why does that have to be that way? So, we worry about a lost $1 billion embassy, a $300 million refit of the Bagram Air Base, or $80 billion lost in military hardware and training, empty shelves. Who worries about a little inflation? See, that's the thing. That's the nose of the camel in the tent. Well, I'm not too worried if inflation's 4 or 5%, and then next month it's 8%, and then it's 10%, and it's just incrementalism, which is how I think they operate. Who worries about a little inflation? Under the new monetary theory, printing dollars brings prosperity. Or the White House Chief of Staff, Ron Klain, put in a retweet, inflation is a mere high-class problem of the Peloton elite. I mean, it's just, what are you saying? That's not what it is. As one congresswoman said, gas and oil are going to be gone anyway in 10 years. So if he slashes over 2 million barrels a day in U.S. oil production, what's wrong with that? Well, we can't survive without oil and gas. The Energy Secretary long ago bragged that when we hit $8 to $10 a gallon, we approach European levels of proper fuel usage. So in other words, let's get the price high enough, and that will naturally cause people to cut back. Did not Americans learn critical legal theory and critical race theory? Or as the architect of the 1619 Project, everybody familiar with the 1619 Project, which is this new educational system that replaces the founding of our America, of our country, from basically 1776 and all that happened then, back to 1619 when slaves were first introduced. That's where our country really started, and that even the American Revolution and all the wars are the results of racism. Everything is related to racism, and they're teaching that in a lot of our schools. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey shrugged off torched downtown buildings. Such torch stuff, he said, is mere bricks and mortar. Why worry about it? It's only a crime to steal over $500 of needed dollars of needed merchandise from a Walgreens in San Francisco, because the rich who make such absurd laws never have to steal goods from a primary shelf. Jesus said there'll be a rise in lawlessness. We're not seeing a rise in it. We're seeing an explosion of lawlessness. We are in a left-wing roller coaster headed to a socialist nirvana. Most Americans believe it is instead out of control, Mr. Toad's wild ride nightmare with incompetence at the wheel. But the architects of such hope and change shrug that the occasional disturbing news that the media sometimes accidentally leaks out is merely the cost of an equitable America. One man's anarchy is another's road to justice. So kind of a viewpoint from there. And one more thing, this is, again, whether or not this all comes to pass, we'll just have to wait and see. We've all heard the predictions on the oil or on the energy issues that we're facing. And the title of this article is Perfect Winter Storm, Simultaneous Shortage of Oil, Natural Gas, Propane, and Coal. We were, up until not long ago, the leading producer in the world of oil and gas. But now, because of certain administration mandates, we're asking Saudi Arabia to produce more to provide the oil we need. Just totally unnecessary. Doesn't need to be. We are facing potentially, what we are facing is potentially extremely serious. Right now, we are already in the midst of an epic global energy crisis. There have already been significant power outages all over the planet, and prices are spiking at a pace that is absolutely breathtaking. With each passing day, it seems like supplies of oil, natural gas, propane, and coal just keep getting tighter. And what is really odd is happening so early in the year. If things are this bad already, what are things going to look like when we get to January and February? One gas station in California was now selling gasoline at $7.59 a gallon. That's just one small town, but it's, I think, on average in California over $5 now, if I'm not mistaken. The good news is that a gallon of gasoline is not nearly that high in most of the rest of the nation, but the bad news is that prices are rising aggressively from coast to coast. Fox News is reporting that the price of gasoline has risen for 22 straight days. The main reason why prices are skyrocketing is because supplies are starting to get really tight. Totally unnecessary. It doesn't need to be this way. In fact, it is being reported that the crude oil hub in Cushing, Oklahoma could be effectively out of crude in just a few weeks. J.P. Morgan's commodity consultant Natasha Kaneva writes that in a world of pervasive natural gas and coal shortages are forcing the power sector to increasingly turn to oil, crushing, which is further exacerbating the oil shortage. So in other words, as natural gas and propane and coal shortages rise, they switch to oil, which is in great supply, but it's not being brought to market. Maybe just weeks from being effectively out of crude. This is that one place, this one area in Oklahoma. The bank's conclusion: if nothing were to change in the Cushing balance over the next 2 months, we might expect WTI spreads to spike for record highs, a super bandwardation scenario. Don't ask me what all that means. Needless to say, we have never seen anything like this before. In such a scenario, how high could the price of oil potentially go? And if oil price records are being shattered in the months ahead, what will ordinary Americans have to pay to fill up their vehicles? I have a feeling we're about to enter uncharted territory. And I won't read on, but there's, I think, a reference in here to the potential for what they call a propane Armageddon, that propane is becoming in short supply. Coal is in short supply. And this just isn't the United States, it's all over the world. This concludes by stating, again, this is just one writer's opinion, but says that I hope you have a plan for this winter and beyond, because things are really starting to get crazy out there. So, a little bit of uplifting information, if you will. But is anybody as shocked as I am that all of this is happening so quickly?
No.
Yeah, it really is. It's amazing.
You probably never thought you'd see all this while teaching your class.
Yeah, man. Unbelievable. So with that, I'd like to return to our study of Israel. We'll get into that. Hopefully, we've got some pretty good time left to review a little bit about what we talked about last week. And I want to just read a paragraph from a book written by a guy by the name of Charles Ryrie. Back in the Charles was a professor of theology, well known for the Riary Bible, which is a study Bible. Very learned man. He wrote this book back in 1969. Actually, the first iteration of it was in 1969, and it was originally entitled, let's see if I can find it here. Well, it had an original title. It was different than what it is. It came down to. It's had like 4 printings, and the title now is The Final Countdown. This is like the fourth printing or the 4th iteration that came out in 1986, but the original book was written in 1969, which is 21 years after Israel became a nation, which I thought was interesting. But here's what he said in his chapter, concluding his chapter on what he's labeled as Israel and her future. He says, Israel's birth and rise to a place of importance is one of the most astounding facts of modern history. And that's about what we're going to dig into now. The increasing attention focused on Jerusalem and the talk of a new temple, again, 1969 or so, are matters we would not have dreamed of a few years ago. You know, if you go back before 1948, you had certainly theologians and people that knew the Bible that said that at some point in time, Israel will be a nation, but it's kind of like what we say today. At some point, the Lord's coming back, but, you know, not quite sure when, and the same then. But he's saying that the increasing attention focused on, again, Jerusalem, the talk of a new temple, are matters we would not have dreamed of a few years ago. There is a Jewish political state in Palestine. I wish he hadn't used that word, but because Palestine is really a misnomer. It should be Israel, but he did use the term Palestine. There is a Jewish political state in Palestine, and Jewish people are returning to that land every day. These are the realities of our times. All this is significant. Our Lord said, when you shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the door. Matthew 24:33. And certainly today we are seeing many signs happening at the same time. And this is 1969. Think about what we're seeing today. A condition which has not been true in any previous time. A true Christian cannot help but rejoice in the knowledge that all this seems to indicate that any day the church may be caught up to be with the Lord forever. This prospect delights the heart of a child of God. Ordinarily, we don't get into the rapture for a while, but I think what we'll do this year is we'll introduce a look at Israel, talk about some things related to Israel. I'd like to get into a little bit on Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 9. Not an in-depth study, but it's fascinating to get into those chapters, particularly as we look back over the prophecies that were given to Daniel 2,600 years ago or so. So I want to spend a little time and then just dive into the rapture, because I think that's, for those of us that are sitting here, all this is interesting stuff. But for us, the next thing on God's, I think on God's agenda, his plan, for his plan, is the rapture of the church. As we all know, and I think anybody that listens to the to those that many of us tend to listen to, they're all saying the same thing, that the rapture is imminent. If we're reading about all these things that relate to the tribulation and the return of Christ, and subscribe to a pre-trib rapture, which we'll talk about when we get to it, how close can it be? It's close. So I think we'll get into the rapture pretty quickly.
We
Yeah, sure.
Because, oftentimes when you talk about a pre-trib rapture, you get thrown in your face. No, that just came about in 1880
Yeah.
or whatever it was, and it's a new phenomenon.
Yeah.
And I think it would be really informative if we could look at what the thinking was
Right.
back, in the hundreds, the 200s, the 300s, up until we got
Right.
into the Greek way of thinking
Right.
that kind of introduced where most people are at right
Right.
now. I think that would be a fascinating study.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll weave that in because you're right. There are those that say that the rapture didn't become an accepted idea until John Nelson Darby brought it about in the 1850s, which we can, I think, pretty easily refute. And even if that were true, the fact that it became more a topic that was paid more attention to, even if it happened in 1850, doesn't mean it's not true. And so we'll get into that. And I think even Paul thought that he could be caught up before he passed away, and we'll see that pretty closely when we get into that
And
study.
If we could look at the other pastors or
Yeah.
theologians
Right.
at that period of time.
Yep.
Because I've heard things like D.L. Moody and others kind of came to that same conclusion independently of Darby that, this looks like this might actually be what the situation is.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that would really be fascinating.
Okay. Definitely we will. Let's take this a step further. The Jews are going back to Israel, and their nation has to be established there. But they are going back in unbelief, and we'll see that's a very important thing to remember, that we'll dissect it and dive a little bit deeper into that topic, but the Jews are returning to Israel in great numbers and have been since 48 from virtually every corner of the world. I think right now the Jews have returned to Israel from over 100 different nations, exactly as the Bible said they would, that there'll come a point in time when God will scatter them to the four winds, but then because of his love for Israel, he'll bring them back. But he's going to bring them back in unbelief. And if you look at the Jewish people today, and we've mentioned this before, there are certainly Jews who have accepted Christ, but that percentage is very small. And they're coming back in unbelief because the purpose of the tribulation is Israel's salvation. That's really the primary purpose, as we'll see, of the tribulation. That 7-year period of time is for the Jews to come to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. They haven't gotten there yet, but they have to come back in the land first. So many things, as we'll see, are dependent upon the Jews being back in the land. And today, if you go back to 1948, when Israel became a nation, there were some 600,000 or so Jews. If you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, that number was probably close to 40,000. So it's going from 40,000 to 600,000 to today, roughly 7 million. So it's just an amazing thing, and it's fascinating. As we've said before, Israel is kind of the linchpin or the edge pieces in God's puzzle for the end times. Everything emanates from that, and what we're going to take a look at tonight. The future of Israel is a glorious one, but before the glory there will be intense suffering and persecution, which will take the lives of many. We'll talk about that. If the Lord should come for his church within the next few years, many unsaved Jews who have gone back to Israel will be killed by Antichrist and in the judgments of the wrath of God, and will spend eternity in the lake of fire. So basically what he's saying is, and let me just read on, the Jews are God's chosen people, that the Jews are the chosen people, or that they are being used in working out the prophetic purposes of God, does not in any way mean that they can be saved today apart from a personal faith in Jesus Christ. That's one of the arguments that certain people will make, is that we, and those that believe that there's a role for Israel are taking a position that God has two groups of people. But at the end of the day, everybody is saved through the blood of Jesus Christ, Jew, Gentile, or whatever. He does have a certain plan for the Jews, as I think we'll pretty clearly see, and but they still today, since the death of Christ, the only way a Jew can be saved is through Jesus Christ, by believing in his shed blood. Now, that gets a little confusing when we get into Romans, where it says all Israel will be saved. That has to do with the tribulation period, has to do when Jesus actually returns, and when he physically comes back, the Jews that are here at that time will, as we read in the book of Zechariah, recognize the one they pierced. All right, that's all Israel, the people, the Jews that are alive at the very end when Jesus returns. That's what's being said in Romans, and we'll explain that further, and what is meant by all Israel will be saved. It doesn't mean that every Jew who's ever lived will be saved, because that just can't be. A Christian can rejoice at what he sees taking place, but he should also be sad when he reflects on the lost spiritual condition of the people to whom it is happening. These same paradoxical feelings come to a believer when he thinks of the coming of Christ. This prospect brings joy to his heart. We should be joyful, not fearful, and but it also reminds us that after Christians have been taken up, which is the reference to the rapture before the tribulation, there will be no further opportunities to do for God the things we have always planned to get around to someday. What I am telling you is what the Lord told John in vivid drama recorded in Revelation 10:8 through 11. The book which John was commanded to eat was pleasant to taste but bitter to digest. Prophetic truth isn't pleasant to taste, but the contemplation of its full implications may bring heaviness of heart. We rejoice in the revelation of coming triumph and glory. We are distressed at the present lost condition of multitudes, and the knowledge that terrible judgments will precede coming glory. So, 1969. I thought that was kind of interesting. Okay, last week we started to dig into the Abrahamic Covenant, and I want to just go back and go to back to Genesis, when God announced to Abram and Sarai, his wife, that they would be the parents, that Abraham would be the father of a great nation. So what that is a reference, and if we're going to need to go back to Genesis 12, and we'll just quickly go through that again, that God told Abram that from his lineage, will one day come a new nation. And that nation obviously refers to Israel. So let's just take a look and go through Genesis 12 again. And I'm beginning in verse 1. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation." In other words, at that point in time, the world had, as we read in chapter 11, had become awash in paganism, idolatry, to the point where God had to confound the languages and scatter the people, because they were trying to reach heaven by building the Tower of Babel, and everything was pagan. So in order to reveal himself, and that's one of the primary purposes of Israel, is to be a people through whom God can reveal himself to those people and to the rest of the world as well. So God has used Israel to be the mechanism through whom, the people through whom he's revealed himself. The Jews have been commanded to write the scriptures for the most part. I think there's only one Gentile in the whole Bible. That the prophets were called by God. They're all Jews. They recorded God's word. They preserved God's word. They served as, again, the people through whom God would reveal himself. And so that's why he created, and we'll see in Deuteronomy in just a moment, that it's not because they were special, but they would be the people through whom God would reveal himself. We've seen it throughout history, and we're going to again see it up close, or people on the earth are going to see it up close and personal in the not too distant future. I will make you, Abram, into a great nation, and will bless you. I will make your name great. You will be a blessing. And then interesting, we talked about this last week. I will bless those who bless you. That's a promise not just to Abraham, but to Abraham and his descendants. So whoever blesses Israel, and by Israel we mean not just the land of Israel, but the people as well. So Israel is a reference to the Jewish people. It also references the land of Israel, etc. So it's the nation of Israel. So whoever blesses you and your descendants and the land and so forth, I will bless. And again, we mentioned last week that the one nation that stands out above every other is the United States. That we have been a nation that has supported Israel throughout history, since they became a nation. We've done so in just the through the last administration. But I think that things are about to turn, and there is a price to be paid for turning against Israel. And let me just quickly summarize another article that I think should be kind of concerning, because it gets to the potential for turning against Israel, which is, with everything else that's going on, is if we do, we're going to be cursed. So here's an article, and I'm just going to read just a couple of snippets from it. Inviting God's judgment, U.S. looking to deny Israel's sovereignty over Jerusalem. We're going to talk about Jerusalem as well, because Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. It's a city that God had established to be where the temple would be, where he would be worshipped. Never intended for it to be divided. One of the things that the Trump administration did was to declare that all of Jerusalem belongs to the Jewish people. That means East Jerusalem, West Jerusalem, the whole city. And East Jerusalem is where the holy sites are, the temple, and so on. And so he confirmed that our position was that Jerusalem, all of Jerusalem, belongs to the Jews, which I think is why we were so blessed during his period of time. Not that, there toward the end with COVID and everything, things started to turn around, but again, it's not to say that Trump or any other leader is the be-all and end-all, because it's God that does it. But we recognized Israel, and I believe that during that period of time we were blessed. But if we're going to turn against Israel and suggest that they divide their land, or some of the other things that are being contemplated, that's just one more nail in our coffin. So here's a quick overview. It says the administration wants to reopen a consulate for Palestinian affairs in Jerusalem as part of its efforts to reverse former U.S. President Trump's policies and achievements. The plan would divide the united capital of Jerusalem and push any chance for peace with the Palestinians farther away, as well as break diplomatic norms, violate U.S. law, and damage America's special relationship with Israel. That bodes very badly, I think. Last week, Israel's Justice Minister Gideon Sa'ar said Israel, quote, cannot and will not agree to divide Jerusalem by permitting a U.S. Palestinian consulate to open. He clarified, that seems like, well, that's no big deal, it's just a consulate. But it's just one more step. It's one step that will ultimately lead to another attempt to create an independent state of Palestine within the nation of Israel, to further divide that land, which is, as we mentioned last week, is what Joel said will be the reason for Armageddon, is that they scattered my people and divided my land. So more on that next week, but let's get back into, so it's just a lot of things going on currently. It doesn't surprise me that we have a number of anti-Semites actually in the administration, and this desire by many in the administration to turn away from Israel. We had that vote a couple of weeks ago where several Congress people declared that we should not support the refurbishing or the resupplying of the Iron Dome, which, as we said last week, is a defensive system. Fortunately, that vote was overturned, and we're now doing that. But our policy toward Israel is vital. It's something we need to pay very close attention to. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And if we look back through history and look at great empires that have come and gone, the one thing that they have, and go all the way back to Egypt, Syria, Babylon, Greece, Rome, the Byzantines, the Ottomans, even the British Empire, every one of those empires had policies that were anti-Israel, against Israel. As we'll see, and I don't know if we'll get into it or not, but the British Empire. When I was a kid, when we went to school, we learned that the British Empire is the empire upon which the sun never sets. It was so big. But the British Empire, toward the end of, right after World War II, toward around 1946 or 47, had declared that Israel has a right to have its own state, but they reneged and turned against Israel. Today, the British Empire is just nothing. There is no British Empire. It's basically just Great Britain and whatever else is a part of it. So every empire or nation that's turned against Israel has collapsed. And you can see that when we even through the Bible, you'll see in the book of Daniel that Nebuchadnezzar had a dream of an image of nations and empires that would control Israel, and every one of them fell. We'll get into that in greater detail when we get into Daniel. Fascinating study. So we have evidence of that. You know, when these words were written, and we know that it was Moses who recorded the words of the Torah, which included Genesis, that he's writing these things faithfully under God's direction. And now today we can look back and say, okay, yeah, here's example after example after example that of what God said. So we'll go on to read that I will bless those who bless you. Whoever curses you, I will curse. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And we'll see as we go through some additional scriptures how God made sure that the Israel consisted just of Jews. He repeatedly told Isaac and told Jacob and Esau and everybody not to marry, quote, Canaanite women. And the reason for that is that the lineage, and it's kind of hard to understand, but we have to take the word for it, that the lineage from Abraham all the way down through David and Judah and so forth had to be strictly Jews that made up that lineage. In other words, the royal line, if you will, had to be preserved, because if they contaminated it by bringing in those that worship false gods, that would, quote, contaminate the lineage, or would have made it impossible for Jesus to be born. So God, as we'll see, just amazingly orchestrated the whole putting together of the nation of Israel so that all peoples could be on earth could be blessed, which means that blessed through the one who would come a couple thousand years later, the Lord Jesus Christ, that he came through that lineage. That's how all peoples, Jews and Gentiles alike, would be blessed. Then we go down to verse 6. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of, we read this last week, of Morah at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land, so it was some 400 years later that the Jews would finally, I mean, Abraham was there, but the Jews as a nation would finally enter into the promised land. But the Canaanites and the other tribes that were there were not quite evil enough yet. And we see that prophesied when God told Abraham that his descendants would be in captivity for 400 years, which is a prophecy about being in Egyptian captivity for that period of time, after which they would come out, and the inhabitants of Canaan would have become so evil that God would drive them out and allow the Jews to go in. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. So that's an interesting thing that here God is telling Abram that I am going to create a nation, a great nation from you, multitudes of people. And then obviously from this, Abram built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. So he believed what God said, which means that here he was getting on in years, and Sarah was beyond childbearing years. How is that going to happen? You know, at first he didn't know that he believed that if this great nation was going to come, he was going to have a son to whom his birthright could be passed. But yet, it seemed like it was impossible at the time, but he believed. And we read throughout that Abraham, that God said certain things, Abraham believed him, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Then we go over to chapter 13, and down to verse 14, where we read, and I read this last week as well, the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had parted from him, he's in the land, he's in what we today call the West Bank, and he's saying to Abram, look around from where you are to the north, the south, to the east, and the west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you. So here God is telling Abram, while he's standing in what we today call the West Bank, all this land I am going to give to you and your descendants. And he says forever, which means that the land was given by God to Abram and his descendants as an everlasting inheritance. Now, does that mean they would forever reside there? No, but it's their land. It doesn't belong to any Palestinian state. Nobody has a right to tell Israel that they can't build neighborhoods in the West Bank and try to control what they do, because God has given that land to the Jews as an everlasting inheritance. And we got like 10 more minutes? 10 more minutes? Okay. Makes sense so far? So this land, which is the constant it's just in the news all the time. Israel is a constant source of agitation to the whole world. It's a source of agitation to its neighbors. It's a source of agitation to Iran, to Iraq, to the United States, to the world. Jews and Israel have been a thorn in the side of the whole world. And this is exactly what God said would happen. And the reason is that the land is given to them by God. And there's a tremendous spiritual battle. The enemy has been trying to disrupt God's plans from the very beginning. And he's continuing to do so today. So he gave the land to them as an everlasting inheritance. Now, quickly, we'll go to chapter 15, and then we'll finish there. And by the way, I have a map. I wish I could show it, but maybe next week I'll pass it out, that shows we get into Joshua, coupled with what we just read here, the land that God gave to Israel as an everlasting inheritance, is a whole lot bigger, larger than what they currently occupy. That land that God promised to them goes down into Egypt, all the way across Saudi Arabia. It consists of, Jordan is part of it. Goes up into Iraq, Lebanon, parts of Syria. That whole big circle is the land that God gave to them. Today they occupy just a small percentage, small piece of the land that God gave to them. But because he gave it to them as an everlasting inheritance, one day they will have control of all of it. We know that because God said they would. They don't have it all right now. Tiny little piece of land the size of New Jersey is just a small part of what God gave to them. I know I haven't calculated, but I would say that all of the land he gave them probably pretty similar to the size of all of Iran. And we'll see a map of that next week. So a whole lot more, and that's all part and parcel to what we're seeing going on. So Abraham, or chapter 15, real quick. After this is verse 1, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. Abram, starting to have some questions now, said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus? Eliezer was his what was the word I'm looking for? Not slave, but he was his assistant. Let's call him his assistant, his number one assistant. And in that culture, if a father did not have a son, then his number one servant would be given control or be given the inheritance. All right. So he didn't have a son. He says, so that means Eliezer, my number one servant, will gain this. I remain childless. So what am I supposed to do here? And Abram said, you have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him, this man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. And we'll see back when we get into chapter 17 that even though God made that promise, that's one area that Abram and Sarah struggled with and made a decision that had some pretty long-term impact. So then he says, he took him outside and said, this is the Lord to Abram, look up to the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said, so shall your offspring be. So here's Abram, childless. He's in his 90, or he's getting close to 100. Sarah's pretty close to 90 at this time, give or take, maybe in their 80s, whatever. They're really old. They're beyond their childbearing years. But yet here's God saying that you're not only going to have a son, but your descendants will be as numerous as the stars. Abram believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of the Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. So he took these offerings, sacrificed them, cut them in two, and separated them so that the various items, the heifer, the goat, the ram, he cut them in two, separated them. Now, when two parties at this time, entered into a contract, what they would do is both parties would do exactly what they did here, and they would walk in kind of a figure-8 fashion between those animals and so forth that they sacrificed. That constituted the completion of a contract or a covenant. So it was the two parties, and that's how they did it. Rather than today we sit down, as I mentioned last week, at a table and two parties will sign the agreement and it's done. This is how they did it at that time, but something very interesting happens. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. Then birds of prey came down in the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep. God put him into a deep sleep. And a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. First prophecy about the coming time when they would be enslaved and captured in Egypt. That's where they were for 400 years. So God is prophesying. We know that that's exactly what took place. But I will punish the nations they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In other words, this captivity, the 400 years, will happen after Abraham passes away. In the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. In Deuteronomy, when they come out, we read that their sins did reach the level that God said was necessary before they were kicked out and replaced by the Jews. When the sun set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. So this blazing torch, smoking fire pot, symbolizes God himself. Now what's going on here? God is going between those pieces by himself. It's not a two-sided covenant. This covenant where he promised to make them a great nation and gives them the land forever is solely dependent upon God to fulfill. Because he knows full well that if this covenant required obedience or any actions on the part of the Jews, it never would happen. Why? Because of the sin nature. They couldn't do it. And so in order for this covenant, the one where he gives them the land, now there's going to be another covenant that is going to come about a little bit later on that does require obedience on their part, but this covenant is solely dependent upon God to fulfill. He and he alone. It's what's called a unilateral or one-sided covenant. It's unconditional. In other words, there's nothing that Israel can do to change it, and it's eternal. So this covenant is symbolized by this image of God. It's shown here as a smoking fire pot. Going between those two pieces by himself means that this covenant is solely dependent upon him. And later we'll see some scriptures where it clearly, God refers to the covenant as my covenant, not our covenant. This is my covenant. So he's made several promises, including the land, which of course we're reading about in the news all the time today, that he gave that to the Israelites, to the Jewish people, as an everlasting, unconditional, unilateral covenant of the promise. So if God doesn't give them the land, doesn't allow them to take control of it eternally, then that makes God a liar. Because he promised to make this promise or these promises everlasting. Does that make sense to everybody? Unilateral, unconditional, everlasting. So when we see all these people, all these groups, nations, United Nations, European Union, the United States, whoever, telling Israel what to do, they're not violating or going against Israel. They're going directly against God himself. It's a slap in God's face. Why? Because the Israel, as we read about in Zechariah, is the apple of God's eye, and everlasting. And we'll see next week, we'll get into several scriptures that confirm this everlasting covenant. So on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham his covenant. That's what this was symbolized by going between the divided pieces. To your descendants I give this land from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates. And then it goes on to, because at the time all these Canaanites and Kenzanites and Canaanites and Hittites and Mosquitobites and everybody else were living in the land, but God was ultimately going to give it to them. All right? Comments, questions that make sense? So very, very vital that we see that, because this covenant that was entered into, this unilateral covenant, is as relevant today as it was 4,000 or whatever years ago. It's still, if it's unilateral, everlasting, and unconditional, it still has to be in effect, right? And it's amazing to sit back and I've often said that if people just knew a little bit about what the Bible says, they would just let the Jews go back, and why risk being cursed, which, as we're going to see, is going to be pretty rough for those that don't buy into it. So, as I've often said, if we know just a little bit about Bible prophecy, when you see and read the news about Israel, and if we're ever tempted to say, well, why not give those people, nothing. God loves the Palestinian people or the Arabs just as much as he loves the Jews and us, but it's not for them to take control over Israel. It's not their land. So it's fighting against God Almighty. All right. Let's just, Father, we've covered a lot of ground tonight, and I ask that each of us go back and think about just how significant Israel is, and focus on that a little bit, and do our own research, our own homework. It's a lot to digest. I understand that, Lord. But I think if nothing else, if we can come away realizing that you are solely, or the Israel and the world is solely dependent upon you. This is your covenant with your people, and nothing is going to take that away. You're the one that decides if Israel's going to be punished. You're the one that decides to scatter them. You're the one that decides to bring them back. You're the one that brings them back in unbelief. It's all your plan, and you've orchestrated these events, but it all gets back to your unconditional, unilateral, everlasting contract with Israel, with the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I ask, Lord, that you bless everyone here tonight, bring us back next week, and we just pray all these things in the name of our blessed Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.